Hello, everyone. This is Jeremy Dennis, lead artist of Moz House. Thanks so much for tuning in. On this House podcast episode, we're featuring current resident artist of March 2025, Prince Shakur. Prince is a multimedia artist, award-winning author, educator, and grassroots organizer, exploring queer Black histories and radical narratives. Born to Jamaican parents in Cleveland, he wrote 6 books by 20 years old and has merged activism with journalism, contributing to Teen Vogue and Afropunk. His memoir, When They Tell You to Be Good, won the Hurston Wright Crossover Award and led to international artist residencies. Beyond writing, he's a filmmaker, podcast co-host, and adjunct professor at Lehman College, using storytelling as a tool for activism. With over 60,000 social media followers, he continues to amplify radical education and cultural exploration. So welcome, Prince.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I wanted to jump in with this first question just about your different mediums to start out. So you do a little bit of writing, filmmaking, podcasting. Podcasting is almost documentary form. It's so thorough and many layers. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how they all intersect with each other and how do you use these mediums to explore radical histories and the diasporic identity in your work?
First, thank you for hosting this residency and having this space. It's really inspiring. I started off fiction and then I got into journalism. That was also after I started doing grassroots organizing. And I think my journalism was influenced by the kind of topics that journalists should be talking about systemically. Those things just kind of fed each other. I wanted to speak to certain things. Now with video, I definitely really love film and cinema. I don't think I'm to the point with videography where I can fully get behind the camera and plan everything that needs to be done. Of course, film is about the crew and the production team. With the writing, I always thought of the stories I wanted to write as kind of movie trailers. That visual language informed my writing. Now, doing podcasting, YouTube, and video essays about these radical topics, I see how my writing fed into my journalism. The journalism was influenced by my organizing experience. Now I look at the video essays I put out on YouTube and I see it as literally an essay, but in video form. And even in the past number of months, I've found that when I'm talking about radical things, I like to pull from cinema or film, scenes, images that get across the things that I'm saying, because I do think media is one of the many sites of revolutionary change and radicalism. And so what does it mean to merge my own political thoughts, the socio-political context that's around me, and then to use media that's already out there as a signifier or a signal? And then with podcasting, I think being a journalist and liking journalism in certain ways, because I hate journalism a lot too, but I think podcasting almost made me like journalism more in a way, because I really respect the idea of offering people propaganda, but propaganda that's like earnest and well-researched and based in a particular context. And if there's anything that I want to say that I'd ever approach journalistically, it would be my podcasting and the ways that I want to bring information to people. I never want to say that I know everything, I have the right path forward, but I will say this is my experience, this is what history tells me, this is what these questions about history can help us explore. I think with different mediums, it's always good to practice different things, because if you're too tied to one particular art form, maybe you mess up in that medium that year, and whatever you consider that to be messing up, or you don't have as much success, and how do you come back from that? And I think exercising all these different lanes helps me stay more grounded.
I like how you describe your filmmaking as the desire to create a trailer, because you're shedding light on so many things that need to be celebrated and highlighted. Do you hope that the trailer becomes someone else's work in the future, like they create the movie for it, or do you hope to be the author of that?
Yeah, all of the above. I have written 1 or 2 features before, not with the intention of filming them. When I published my first book, I moved to New York and I had a friend write a mini series script based on my book. I was really inspired by that. With the way I came up with writing, it was a lot of seedy fan fiction. For me, it's like the ethic of fan fiction is like take something that's already there and make it your own or make it unique. So I think it's all of the above. I hope to inspire people to make their own art, but I also want to continuously be in conversation with what I'm making now and what my body of work in the past is and what I hope for it to be in the future.
Speaking of inspiring others, a few days ago here at Ma's House, you led a intro to podcasting. So you shared a little bit about your podcasting career, the tools, how to do the big why. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some tips in terms of, like, you had such a great turnout, great conversation, but how do you bridge the gap between like attending that and then actually like going episode to episode? What's the motivating force for you starting out?
I think it's liking something enough to have a frame of reference in terms of why or how you like it. Then step 2 is liking something enough to begin to develop what your own approach might be. And step 3 is not getting in your own way to the point that you can actually begin to execute and experiment and troubleshoot and skill build. Because yeah, I mean, I even think of this because like since I've been here, something I've been doing since I've never done a residency where there's no other artists in residence really. And it's been really cool. I've been calling different friends every day and being like, how are you? And I talked to my friend recently and she's really talented and smart and has worked like a salary job and recently moved out of the country. She studied documentary work or media work in university. It's interesting because, of course, what you study isn't what you always end up doing. But I talked to her a lot about media, and we both have done YouTube, but I've done it more consistently. I always try to be very encouraging. We were talking a day or two ago, and she was just like, oh, I have a lot of ideas, but I don't have the faith in myself to execute. And that's what I mean when it's like not getting in your own way, because I can look at her and be like, you're talented, you're smart. Of course, we all have insecurities and you want to find your style and that takes time. But I think a lot of it is people just get in their own way. They have a certain idea that their taste doesn't match their execution. When anyone's getting into something new, you either have to humble yourself and be like, it's not going to be great right away, or you have to enjoy the process of it kind of sucking and figure out what in the process you like. Because I think with writing, I've always told myself, fall in love with the process. And if the industry or whatever doesn't serve you, then so be it. And granted, I don't always follow that, but I feel what's helped me is just loving it enough to want to try it, to find my approach. And the approach meaning like how you love it when you start trying, and then how you love it once you're deeper into it. Because in the past 6 months with podcasting, I've learned to love editing more. And for the first 2.5 years of doing it, I hated editing. It's just being committed enough. And I say this a lot with writing too. It's the behind the scenes work that counts. A lot of people with media want to come off a certain way, have a certain impact, or want it to be perfect. And all of that is almost like you can't control all of that stuff. All you can control is sitting down, recording, backing that stuff up, and getting to editing. For me, it's just get out of your own way. I really do believe that. And it's also the question of what are you doing it for? Are you doing it to help others? Are you doing it to help yourself? Are you doing it because you want to experiment? All of those can be genuine and earnest things. And they also have the double-edged side, like the side where it's like, if you're doing it for other people, but that can also be impact driven. And so I think it's all of those things. And mostly it's just start, try, mess up, put something out, regret it later, but at least you did it.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great answer. Sounds like you also had a lot of mentors in your life who maybe carried on some of those tips and instilled them. I think just all throughout your answer, you're talking about how you motivate others, check in with others, encourage. I think we don't do that for each other enough. It's really wonderful to hear. I wanted to move on to now your personal work too. Your memoir, it's titled When They Tell You to Be Good. It grapples with your political coming to age as a queer Jamaican American. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how your very personal narrative intersects with the much broader, like, radical histories that you're invested in sharing and exploring in your work.
That's good. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's really how I approached my book. I wanted to write about the personal, but also situate it in the structural in an emotionally driven way and use some of my practice as a journalist. And what that looked like was looking at my upbringing, how coming up queer was hard, the different rules about masculinity that I learned. The book helped me explore that systemically, was looking and researching my family's history, finding documents that related to like court cases that my father or uncles had been a part of, researching Jamaica's history, understanding the impacts of colonization, and theorizing about how that shaped gender and the gender of the people that I grew up with raising me. It helped me find systemic explorations of very personal things, and those explorations helped me draw more complicated conclusions around things that I just been given emotionally in my life. Like for me, it's like I didn't grow up knowing my father, and writing my book, I gained a different kind of understanding of him. And I think how that shows up in my work, I love exploring history, especially Black history, but I also like to look at the sort of underbelly of things or the kind of overlooked things, especially related to masculinity. So what that's looked like in the past is writing different essays about figures like Bob Marley and how he believed he was psychic and predicted the exact age that he would die when he was younger. And what does that mean when you have survived and have seen the decolonial struggles of your country? I wrote about Huey P. Newton, despite being the leader of the Black Panther Party and this strong man, and the photo of him in the arm wicker chair, like he was in solitary confinement for months on end. He had like severe substance use disorders. He was paranoid, and that also like led to the party kind of falling apart in certain ways. The utility someone serves on a mainstream level, I don't think should ever overlook the personal struggles that someone went through. And so I'm interested in kind of humanizing different aspects of Black history, different aspects of radical history, because I think when we mythologize it so much, it becomes this story as opposed to like a real history that we're actually in a continuum of. And I feel like that's what I kind of come back to again and again. Like I've been writing a novel about the Black queer boys' experience in the late 80s, coming up through the beginning of the AIDS crisis. And so looking at a piece of history, humanizing it, and really finding the stories in it, because I think that's how I got radicalized in college, like having a teacher who was communist, but he taught us history in a way that made it feel like, oh, I'm actually learning about people. It's not just dates and phrases in a book.
That's such a great answer. I remember in your podcast workshop, someone asked, can a podcast be too a particular or too obscure or personal? So it's great that you make everything approachable and have that human connection, which we sometimes forget to bring. Speaking of podcasts, you currently have The Dugout that you're co-hosting. I believe you described it as the only Black radical anarchist podcast.
Well, I think it might be
the only week. I wonder, you just mentioned a couple of historic figures and ideas within these movements that influence your perspectives, but are there any others that were maybe the core that started this podcast, or do you dedicate it to a certain individual?
No, I think it's in some ways very obviously indebted to Black struggle and Black historical struggles, because I think that to me feels very apparent, because it's like we're having these conversations in the lineage of this larger history. But in terms of specifics, when me and Jordan started the podcast, we had certain figures in mind that we wanted to explore. One of them is definitely Kawasi Balagoon. For anyone listening that might not know, Kawasi Balagoon was a Black Panther and then a part of the Black Liberation Army. He did a bunch of expropriation and breaking people out of jails, and openly identified as bisexual and had a trans partner. And so I think for a lot of Black anarchists and queer folks, like he's one of the first kind of pillars that you learn about. But I also think, in a way, I view this podcast as, it's almost like we're doing it because we haven't really felt or seen anything out there like what we're doing. And so in a way, it's in conversation with history, but also I'm like, none of these mofos out here are doing it like us. And I say that with kind of pride, because I also view it as like, instead of it maybe being indebted to a certain person or idea, it's more like I really want it to be an offering to people. And I also want it to be something that maybe younger me would have adored.
Absolutely. I'm going to go a little bit out of order with these questions, but I just want to talk, maybe shift directions towards social movements and community engagement work that you've done, which is also equally impressive as your writing. You have a significant background in grassroots organizing, from student activism to your work with the Black Queer and Intersectional Collective. I wonder how this direct engagement with social movements shaped your artistic practice, and how you combine these as a tool for storytelling and liberation.
That's such a good question. I think getting into organizing when I was in university, I got into organizing my senior year. A few days before my senior year, Michael Brown was killed, and that started the big uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri. Around that time, I started writing journalistically. My bitterness and hatred towards white supremacy and mainstream media fed that era of my writing and how that feeds into now. Since then, I've continuously tried to tell radical narratives, radical stories. What that means to me is characters experiencing some kind of personal or systemic marginalization, stories that lead to an increased awakening around the systems around us, and how our internal world can then help us combat these external factors. To me, radical narratives, the conclusions that I want to draw aren't like vote and things will get better or liberalism is the answer. For me, like, a radical narrative is like, the answer is burn it the fuck down. And so I think it's about a clear indictment as well. I never want to tell a story that turns away from that. Even if it looks a little different, I do want it to kind of mess with people or make them think or question.
Oh, thank you for that. I keep going back and forth between your time here at Ma's house, different things you've been sharing. And I wonder, just in terms of, you mentioned burn it down as a solution. I think there's definitely alignment within Shinnecock, Ma's house, my personal work. But you mentioned before, one of your friends sent these two white guys on a podcast criticizing your storytelling.
Yeah.
When you see that, like, people giving reactions to your work, which is all about social justice and betterment, does that give you pause? Does that make you reevaluate? Does that make you think, how did they even get onto this subject matter?
Being someone comfortable with posting a lot online because I see a certain utility in it, especially propaganda-wise, and just like, fuck it. I think publishing my book kind of primed me, because I went on a book tour, and because the book was so deeply personal, I thought a lot about what it means to offer those things, and what about if people misinterpret it, and can I be in control or not? That helped me in some ways, because I'd be on book tour and sometimes there'd be older Black folks really giving me praise, and that meant a lot. And then sometimes there'd be an older white woman leaning over the book signing table telling me, I'm so proud of you. I'm like, oh my God, get away from me. This is scary. Even with my book, I remember I read one review by an older gay Black writer who basically was like, this is confusing because it's non-linear and it's not sexy enough. And I'm like, it's a book. So I think the ways that people interpret things is interesting to me, especially if it's earnest. And if it's not earnest, like this example you mentioned a few days ago, I was Googling myself and I found these white dudes on YouTube that don't show their faces, and they live stream and talk shit about leftists who make videos. It sort of feels really weird and extra personal. But then I think back to my book and I'm like, I literally wrote about a threesome and getting caught shoplifting. So I think there's that side. How did they find it? I mean, I'm beautiful and fun, and those videos I made were cool. So I don't know. I think people just latch on to things and they try to land in the algorithm in that way. But I think the lesson for me that I got from that is reevaluating my boundaries with the internet, checking in with how I want to react or not react when those things happen. Because I do think when people do it in bad faith, it's kind of like, I don't know, especially if it's the internet, as long as you're not outside my house waving neo-Nazi flags, I don't need to worry about it. I guess what I'm really speaking to is the anti-fascist practice in me. It's like, unless you're going to beat my ass, cool.
That was actually my next question, is looking at your social media profiles. You're pretty much like an online celebrity, and the amount of shares and likes that you get. I mostly use Instagram, so I'm seeing that. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the role of online platforms and social media for disseminating radical ideas. Do you see any alternatives in terms of just having everything on a website or an up and coming space?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Kind of started out with being a freelance journalist and starting that around 2017 and realizing I have to share my work in order for people to see it. Also, when Twitter was a thing or much bigger, it was a big resource for writers. And so I saw the utility of sharing my work, finding editors and calls for pitches on there. And so there was a material impact that had. And then I also have told myself again and again since then, as a marginalized artist, I would rather put these posts and things out there to build my own narrative around my own practice and career. Because if you're waiting for an interview or someone else to write about it or characterize it, I think you lose some of that power. And then I think just getting more into media and journalism and propaganda. And the other side of it is, I think, being an organizer and doing some work that's visible, some work I never want to talk about in a public platform because who wants to go to jail? But I think doing that behind the scenes propaganda work also taught me a lot about the utility of knowing how to make media, knowing how to make graphics, knowing how to promote stuff. And then when I was a lead organizer with Black, Queer, and Intersectional Collective, and for folks that don't know, that's a collective in Central Ohio that does mutual aid and other organizing for Black LGBTQIA people, I helped write their newsletter. And so I just think over time, I've seen the material utility for posting online, for my career, my art, and for political purposes. I've been doing different projects online since 2012. And whatever I'm experiencing now is after 10, 12 years of throwing darts at a wall. I view a lot of it as momentum. And ideally, I would like to be practiced enough for radical ideas to be compelling or enticing to people. And not necessarily in a manipulative way, but in a way that's earnest and earned. And hopefully in a way that gives me enough income to just pay my rent every month. That's literally all I want. Yeah.
Right. We'll have to do a shout out at the end. Yeah, your Patreon and all that. I did want to change gears into the residencies that you've been to, the creative process, maybe some advice for emerging artists. I wanted to mention that you've been to a few other residencies, including Sam Graham House, Maison Baldwin in France, I believe, and now Ma's House. For some reason, a lot of people don't know what residencies are, that they exist, why people offer them. Can you talk a little bit about your time at these spaces and how they benefit your work?
Residencies are some of my favorite things. And even being here, this is the first one I've done in 3 years. I've gotten so much work done and I've just been like, why have I not applied for more the past few years? Granted, life happens, you get busy. But for me, residencies have been a great validating space. I feel like it sounds weird because I'm like, screw the industry. But also I feel like something like this where it's much more community driven matters so much. And I think residencies in general can offer that. The gradient is kind of different, but I started applying in 2019 because I had a roommate who applied to a lot of them and gave me advice. And the first one I did was Sangham House in late 2019. I was there for a month and I wrote half of my memoir there. And I also got to meet artists in other countries and talk about writing there. And so with a lot of my residencies, I really orient them around book projects I'm working on. And so I feel like this is the first residency I've done in a while where I'm not actively hugely working on a book. It's other art stuff that I'm doing. But yeah, for me, it's been Sangham House was really amazing because that was my first one. I wrote a lot of my book. And then I did Norton Island residency and then Atlantic Center for the Arts. And those were cool too because I was working on my novel. And so I think for a lot of them, it's mostly working on projects, really intensely working on them. Because I'm someone if you lock me away, I'll find a way to make it happen. And then I think the other benefit was meeting other artists and connecting with them. I haven't always had great residency experiences. When I did Atlantic Center for the Arts in 2021, they were really fucked up to an Indigenous artist there. And me and 4 other people ended up walking out with them. That was really traumatizing and messed up. But strangely enough, an artist there introduced me to their literary agent, and that's my literary agent now. And I still talk to folks from that residency and check in with them. For me, it's kind of like a practice in community building and sharing space with people and being open to the fact that you never really know what you're going to learn or do or get from it. It activates the organizer brain in me because I've shown up to conferences or communes in the woods and you're kind of like, well, I'm here for 2 weeks. What are we going to get out of this? So I really view it in that way, but I definitely would say Sangham House was a really dear residency to me. I also did La Maison Baldwin, and that was in south of France in 2022. And even though the person that ran it at the time was like this white lesbian who was messy and not the right person to be managing it, now it has different leadership. It's Black led. That one was beautiful because I was living in south of France in the same town that James Baldwin lived in. I was meeting people that knew him, drinking lots of cheap white wine on tap, and I also just love experiences where it's like, this could be another life that I had or something. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So many benefits, essentially.
Do you have a favorite residency you've done or any that are at the top for you? I'm also asking because I'm
Definitely
trying to apply more.
Oh, if you haven't applied to, well, the first one I went to was Vermont Studio Center.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, that one's really wonderful. Every residency I've been to, I have like criticisms, and sometimes they give you surveys and feedback forms, but I do also like the idea of us being in a place with 30 other artists that you haven't met. You just some networking opportunities. That one I did in June, so it's up in Vermont, sometimes really cold and snowy. So that time of year, if you can get it in the summer, you can go hiking, or it's just like out on the field, or on the lawn. So it was a really great time, but we'll have to go for residencies and ESC, do some swapping of application links. Speaking of which, when you applied to the Miles House residency, I think you expressed an interest in the intersections between Black and Indigenous struggles, including your personal experience of visiting Standing Rock in 2016 during the water protector movement. I wonder, even though we don't have artists stick to their original application, were there certain themes or histories or topics within this intersection that you wanted to explore?
Yeah, I think a part of it was Standing Rock was such a intense experience, and I've also been in movement spaces / campaigns either with Indigenous folks or for campaigns that were specifically about issues that Indigenous folks were advocating for, especially environmental things or stuff at the border that I was helping out with a few years ago. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, to distill it, I mean, I'm interested in the decolonial relationship and solidarity that Black folks and Indigenous folks, and of course there's a clear intersection there, like there are people that are both. I'm interested in navigating that, exploring that, because I think coming from a family that immigrated to the US and then being born here and understanding that I'm both Jamaican, but like a American or a Yankee, and then sometimes I judge how other Black folks operate because I'm like, don't be a colonizer, don't say colonizer things. And so I think I try to be really critical of that, or I think I have been internally, or it's been something that I've moved through in a lot of ways, especially like being young and going to Jamaica, going to school in Jamaica for 2 years and then coming back to the US. And I really think a lot back to what that experience did for me and how it informed so much. And I think it's just something that I want to write towards. And I wrote about Standing Rock a little bit I wrote a chapter in my book, but I think there's a lot more to just unpack in terms of, I'd like to see how I can articulate a committed frame of reference in terms of Indigenous struggle and Black struggles for liberation and where the intersections are. I think mainly I'm hoping to find a language for that, or working towards finding a language for that. I think that'll probably be in some of the writing I want to do after this novel. I'm working on a collection of essays about masculinity and gender and radicalism. I just think with a lot of really leftist spaces I've been in, especially when it's really militant work, if it's not like only Black people, it's usually like there's like not really many Black people, or it's like there's usually more Black women, but the Black men. And then I think about Indigenous movements and spaces I've been in, and I'm like, where are the Black people? Because what's happening to them is happening to us in similar ways. And that to me is almost, it's shocking, but it makes sense because there's so much up against us and people are doing what they need to do to live. And so I guess I'm just interested because I'm like, what is it in my life that led me to Standing Rock and then led me to these other movements and these other spaces to engage in the conversations that I've been lucky enough to be invited into or to have. And I want to kind of give that language at some point.
Absolutely. get a couple copies of your book so your visitors can check them out and read them when they visit Ma's house. I wonder, is it too soon to share what you've been working on during your, I guess it's been a little bit over a week that you've been here at Ma's house?
I've been doing a lot of video essays and editing for the podcast and for YouTube. I've been applying to other residencies and looking up other opportunities and planning in terms of what projects I want to do when I get more funding or grants. But it's been a lot of research, a lot of editing. I think in the next week, I want to sit down and maybe start looking at my novel, but I'm nervous. Is this the right time? I think YouTube-wise, I've been digging into this series I've been working on called Direct Action 101, looking at the history of direct action, the different tactics it utilizes, and doing that as an offering of these histories or these modes of resistance are out there. I'm not saying that other folks have done that, but I wanted to give it my own approach. And then with the podcast, me and my co-host have been researching a lot of future interviews and drafting a lot of outlines and doing a lot of planning in terms of that. I think this is the first residency where I haven't forced myself to only fixate on writing. And so it's been kind of liberating. And I've also been drawing some.
I'll definitely have to share some of that. Well, during your workshop and also earlier in this interview, you mentioned the importance for artists to create work that their younger self would have wanted to see. And even though there's so much resources for up-and-coming youth or student aspiring artists, I wonder if you have something else that you carry with you in terms of advice or insights. How do you get to that point of envisioning something that your younger self would have wanted to see?
That's such a good question. I think first with advice for younger folks, I would say it's okay to feel like the odds are against you. I think it's okay to feel like maybe it's not the most viable way forward, but it's also important to remember why you want to do it. Like if you're doing it for external validation or to prove people wrong, sometimes that can be fine, but you really have to care about it enough to work through those obstacles and those gray areas and those periods. And that's why I say that behind the scenes work matters, like commit to the process, because if you care about the process, you can just continue working. And of course, everyone takes breaks and things change. But if you're only doing it to get a certain kind of result, I don't think that really leads to longevity. In my early 20s, I always said, I just have to outlive the other people that don't deserve it. And it's kind of worked. How do I get to a place where I can envision or make work that my younger self would have wanted? I think a part of it is I both feel far from the me that was 17 and going to college, but I also don't feel that far off. And a part of that is I feel like I have stayed committed to my core values. And for the most part, in terms of work and how I find work, I don't make a lot of money, but I also don't really need a lot of money. I don't really live my life in a way where I have like a car and all these expenses. I think those choices along the way that aligned with my values have allowed me to have a clear line of sight backwards to that younger version of myself. Because I even think about the me in 2018 that was traveling around France and hanging out with my boyfriend at the time. I was starting to write a zine series about Black anarchism because I was like, who's writing about this? And now just years later, I'm embodying that same thing, but just in a different way. And so I think to your second question, it's about really understanding your values and trying as hard as possible not to compromise past a certain point, because then you might regret it, or you might make something or turn into someone that you can't even recognize. And then maybe you realize your younger self would have been disappointed. And that sucks. But I think even that is an opportunity to kind of change your path again.
Absolutely. Such a great answer. To end with, how can people follow your work? How can people support? I know you have the Dugout podcast on Spotify and Apple. Do you have a Patreon or preferred social?
Yeah, if people want to follow me personally, I'm on Instagram. My ad is at Sweet Black Prince. On TikTok, it's at PR Shakur. And also feel free to check out my YouTube channel, Prince Shakur. If you want to support, find me on Patreon. You can just search my name. I co-host a podcast called The Dugout with my co-host Jordan. We have our social media pages. If you follow me, you can find those. And we also have a Patreon for that, that we're really trying to push out there. And any of those places, I made a short film like 2 years ago, and That's online as well. It's called Before I Die. And if people want something that's mumblecore and about two friends walking around and drinking beers at night, it's probably for you.
All right, a lot to check out, a lot to support. Well, thanks again for Prince for being in the residency program and for joining on the podcast.
Thank you.